So welcome. Maybe there's probably going to be some more people drift in. I'm told the coffee lineup was reasonably long, but in order not to shortchange yourselves on time, we'll get underway. My name is Jim Mulvale. I'm with the Ontario Basic Income Network, and I'm very pleased to moderate what I think is going to be a very interesting session. So I'll just introduce the four panelists. They'll all present for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a fair amount of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So I'll start, the person closest to me, I'll go across the table going to your right. That's the order in which the presenters will present. Well, that's not exactly true. Anyway, I'll just introduce everybody and you'll figure out who they all are based on their topic. But we'll go in the order of the program. First of all, we have Steve Richardson, who's an independent researcher, presenting on Social Security basic income. The second presenter will be Thomas Klemm, from, I guess now graduated from Eastern Michigan University, presenting on Native American per capita payments and their relevance to basic income. The third presenter is Jim Bryan from Manhattanville College on the effects of UBI on income mobility across generations. And the fourth presenter is Leandro Ferreira from the Brazilian Citizens Basic Income Network, from cash transfers to basic income with public policy approach in Brazil. So please join me in welcoming the panelists, and I'll call on Steve to begin.
All right, thank you, Jim. I'm really pleased to be here. I've been studying and writing about basic income for about 6 years, but this is the first time I've been able to make one of the congresses. So the timing is good from the standpoint of this topic, because this is the title of a book that I've just completed. And what I'm going to be able to show you in the time allotted is summary level information from chapter 5 of the book. The first 4 chapters lay out the case for income inequality being a problem in the United States, explaining the approach that I'm taking to solving that problem, and then finally in this chapter showing that it can be done. So I'm trying to persuade people who aren't a part of this crew that they should take a closer look at what we can do here. And also, as the title suggests, I'm really looking at a transition of Social Security, which is a safety net for older people, to producing a safety net for all Americans. So with that, I'll get right into it, looking at the summary information that I have. I use IRS data and start with kind of what seems to be the consensus level of $1,000 a month negative basic income guarantee, which is at the poverty level approximately. And my approach is a negative income type. And just, it's sort of arbitrary, but citizens 21 or older is the group that I'm looking at that would receive this income. One of the main objectives here is to eliminate the payroll tax, which is highly regressive, okay? It's a tax on work, and certainly when one of the reasons why we're having to take a look at things like this is concern about availability of work, and certainly also in the basic income, what's the incentive for work. I think we need to address the disincentive to work posed by the payroll tax. My program would be fully paid for. This addresses one of the big objections to the thing. I don't believe that deficit financing is a winner in any way. Most of the money would come from eliminating tax expenditures, which in the U.S. is basically known as deductions. They're targeted deductions from income that focus the benefits on a small number of people, and I'm proposing to eliminate that with just a few exceptions and replace it with deductions in the basic income that would be more broadly based. So the clawback, the negative income part that would maintain the incentive to work is that you would pay a 25% tax on the basic income received, or on the, your wage or your income over and above the basic income. And that would basically wipe out the benefit of the guarantee at about 4 times the amount of the guarantee. So around $50,000 for individuals and twice that much for a married couple. Social Security benefits, I failed to mention, would be fully taxable. So it would be treated like any other income. We can eliminate the payroll tax and therefore stop the earning of additional benefits. But that doesn't eliminate the obligation that we have to pay the people who have already earned those benefits. So the Social Security benefit would continue. It would be treated like any other form of income. And you may or may not have a supplement to that. The tax expenditures would not take care of the whole cost. We would still have to have a surtax that would increase the progressivity of the income tax we have currently. And my estimate is that we would have about, it would start at about 8% and ratchet up to as high as 24% on incomes above the threshold. 8% would be applied at $50,000 for single filers and about $100,000 for married couples. And the higher level, 24%, would apply on very high incomes, like over $250,000 for singles and $500,000 for married couples. I'm thinking that it might make sense for us to implement this in stages. We could actually transition from the payroll tax to the income tax without the basic income. That's not my preference, but it's an option. And I'm going to show you some charts that illustrate that a lot of the benefit is obtained from that first stage. And depending on how long we have to argue about the details of the basic income, that would determine whether it could happen sooner rather than later. So I don't have time to go through all of the details, but I wanted to show you some of the numbers that we're talking about. These are very big numbers. They're in the trillions, right? The payroll tax is $1.2 trillion. As you know, that's assembled from 2 parts, the employee contribution and matched by the employers. And totals 7.65% for a wage person. For a self-employed person, they pay both sides of that. So they're over 15% for the first dollar of earnings. Tax expenditures, the amount is $1.3 trillion. And currently, that's revenue that's foregone by the federal government. And this is a list of the types of things that are included. The most common are mortgage interest, state and local taxes, property taxes, capital gains, etc. Under free to work, most of that would go away. I would retain the ones that are broadly based and very popular: child tax credit, pension contributions and earnings, and individual health care expenditures. The pension and health care in particular are things that people are going to have to take care of themselves, certainly if they don't have Social Security. And I feel strongly that we need to also wrest control of health care from employers and put that those decisions in the hands of individuals as well. So there's a goal there. The next line shows federal income tax. We gather about $1.7 trillion right now. Wouldn't touch that. I'm just dealing with the changes to that would need to be made to pay for the basic income, and those are identified. I've already discussed those briefly. We'd have to implement that for the free to work, a slightly lower amount. I mentioned the 8 to 24%. It'd be more like 6, 12, and 18%. And these are crude estimates, just simply to make the math simpler. Obviously, a lot of argument could take place. Someone with more sophisticated models could dial in a more accurate number. On the entitlement side, we pay out currently $1.564 trillion. I'm eliminating the entire payroll tax, which also includes Medicare. Don't really get into any changes in Medicare, but feel that also needs to be paid for through the income tax and not through the payroll tax. So all that would have to be covered by the measures that I just mentioned. Okay, so the charts that I'm going to show you, and I have 4 slides with about actually 12 charts. I'm really going to talk about half of them. They're really meant to answer a couple of questions. The first question, and I think it's come up earlier, the U.S. tax code actually favors unearned income. This is interest, dividends, capital gains. Wage earners have to pay the payroll tax. That doesn't apply to unearned income. So I think that's an inequity that needs to be addressed. And the second part is how would these proposals change the progressivity, the slope of the curve. So the charts are showing, they're combining the taxes. If we combine payroll and income taxes, what's the end effect on incomes of people at different income levels and also of different types of income. So the first chart, right up here, this is the status quo. This is the existing situation. And I'm sorry it's a little small, maybe hard to read, but you can see the bottom line here is the rate on unearned income, which starts at 0. And the chart for single filers starts at $10,000, roughly the poverty level, and goes up all the way to $160,000. And the wage lines, the second one here, shows that they don't get to start at 0. They start at 4%. That's an average rate. And it goes up to over 20, right? And then the worst of all is a self-employed person who starts at 15% and goes up to 24%. That's not very, that's a pretty flat trajectory when you consider that we're going almost over 10 times the amount of income. The free to work is the second chart. It's really pretty remarkable. Number one, you notice the slope is very different. Everyone starts at 0, and they end up at about the same place. The main thing is that the gap is almost eliminated. The only reason the wage earners pay more is because of that tax on employer-paid health insurance that I mentioned earlier. So it almost like might seem too good to be true, I want to point out, but think that we had $1 trillion that we're recovering from the tax exemptions as paid for most of it. The other thing is that I'm only going up to 160,000. There are a number of people on the other side of this, very high incomes, that are going to get hit by the surtax. A surtax that goes from 8 to 24%. It's sort of, this is almost the break-even point at the high end of this scale here, where the benefit from them not having to pay payroll taxes anymore is offset by the additional tax that they're paying in the income tax. The other thing is that when you get to the really high levels of income, like 1% of 160,000 is the same as 16 percentage points applied to 10,000. So one very rich person can actually provide for a number of basic income guarantees. So the bottom chart is the, having a little trouble with the mic here, standing in the right place. The bottom one is the Social Security basic income. And here we have, it looks like it's pretty flat in here. These numbers are actually virtually identical to the numbers in the chart above, but I had to change the scale. On the y-axis, we had to go to minus 100% because the basic income virtually doubles the income of people at the low end of the scale. It's a minus 95% tax rate at $10,000, and it's still minus 30% at $20,000. So I'm going to skip through these next couple of slides. This is for married filers. The x-axis is twice as high, goes from 20 up to 320, but the percentages are virtually identical to the slide that I just showed you. This slide is for single filers. It looks at things a little differently. Instead of looking at the status quo versus free to work, here we're looking at income types. So this is for wage income, this one's for self-employed, and this one's for the unearned income. So you can compare in this presentation how each of these people with each of these types of incomes at different levels of income benefit from the changes I'm proposing. So on the first one, you see that the worst case scenario is the status quo, the green line here, and they benefit significantly from the free to work when they drop down to the blue line. Then the red line It doesn't really affect the people at the higher levels. It has a tremendous effect on the incomes at the lower level. So I think I'm just about out of time. And so if you want to continue the conversation after today, you can contact me by email. All right? Thank you.
Slideshow.
Oh, sorry.
Beginning.
All right, so, yep, like he had said, my name is Tom Klemm. I am graduated from Eastern. I'm entering into a doctoral program in social work and political science in the fall. I'm also a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. We're from Southwest Michigan in Dowagiac, where our tribal headquarters are located. I also want to acknowledge that we're standing on the occupied lands of the Lenape people, and I greatly appreciate what they've done for the city and their reemergence as a people, and I hope we all can kind of think about them a little today as we walk through the city. All right, so Native American experience with per capita payments, why it matters to the basic income discussion. So what is a per cap payment, which is per capita payment, I should just stick with that. Equal payments made to individual citizens of Native nations, funded most commonly today from casino gaming revenue. So there are certainly other instances of different kinds of businesses, natural resources through which these appear, but the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act kind of spells it out as a policy within a policy. But there were per capita payments pre-Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, so the Lacey Act is actually where it began that annuities from treaties and other things could be paid out on a pro rata basis. And the reason for this was to destabilize Native nations. So individual cash payments as an idea in Native nations was to destabilize them. Tribes wanted to have the incomes just given to the tribes, and then they decide what to do with each. The emphasis with the Lacey Act was so they would disperse. It's in line with the allotment era, where reservations were broken up into individual plots of land and given to people. These were horrible plots of land that they couldn't really farm on, so people had to sell them, and then thus reservations grew smaller and smaller. Indian-owned land went away. And then there was some instances of this in the termination era, but I won't get into that today. All right, so currently there are 572 federally recognized tribes in the United States. 225 tribes have gaming in 28 states. One thing to note, especially though, is that as you can see, less than half tribes have them, and those tribes will likely never have them. Most tribes are located in extremely rural areas, isolated. Businesses like this can't sustain themselves. Many of these tribes that do have casinos are extremely small. The majority of Native peoples do not belong to a tribe that has a casino. And here's some, well, we'll get into it. All right. So IGRA, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, only regulated Indian gaming. It did not allow it. Gaming rights were won by the Capita Band of Mission Indians in 1987 via the Supreme Court. Gaming had been going on reservations prior to that, and it was an exercise of sovereignty, but state cops kept on coming in and arresting people, so the Capita took them to court, and then the feds decided that they needed to regulate this. So American Indians, Alaska Natives were the poorest demographic before IGRA and are still the poorest today. Just to kind of re-emphasize that this hasn't been a silver bullet for Native people. Most Native people are not benefiting in any way from the passing of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act or gaming in general. All right, so within IGRA there are 5 permissible uses of gaming profits. Economic development, tribal government, charitable donations, helping local government agencies, and general welfare of tribal members. So 3 and 4 make me, well, I guess they on the surface don't necessarily make me mad, but often in tribal state compacts, which really shouldn't exist in general, tribes are forced via the state to donate to local schools, local services that had routinely discriminated against that native population the entire time they've been there, essentially coercing them into investing into communities that had either destroyed or not invested into them. So, but 5, general welfare of tribal members, that's important. So once you can show you've done all these things first, IGRA allows a nation to distribute per capita payments to their citizens through a revenue allocation plan. So revenue allocation plans, are, according to IGRA, so since 1993, more than 100 nations have received approval to do this. So there's over 100 nations distributing per capita in some form. It's important to note the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a thing that still exists, has to approve any revenue allocation plan. So any tribe that wants to distribute per caps has to have the Fed say it's okay. It's important to note that there's a wide range of these. So, for instance, $70 a year in the Blackfeet Nation, a very large nation located in Montana, and it's given around Christmas time for members to be able to buy gifts for their kids. And then there are 4 tribes that make up 40% of gaming revenues total for Indian gaming, and they do have a lot more money. Their tribes' populations range from about 200 to 600. So there's very small tribes, often located in urban areas. So tribes like the Navajo Nation, the Cherokee Nation, big, over 300,000 population tribes, don't have per capita payments, and nor do the majority. And also it's important to note that some do it every 2 weeks, some do it every month, biannually, annually, every kind of way you can think of it. So why was per cap included in IGRA? So obviously there was some historical precedent, but I found this kind of funny. So Alex Gabin, who's Osage and was a law professor at the time IGRA was being written in, and wrote this actually, and it was him who did it. And he says there was no argument for or against it. He said, frankly, we did not forecast how successful some of these casinos would become, or how fast it would occur. We didn't know the economies of gaming, the way it was going to develop. And then he also said, frankly, we didn't know that like anyone would be able to pull it off. We didn't even think about it. If you look at some of the big tribes in the Midwest and Great Plains, they may never meet the needs of their tribal citizens, which is true. And Dr. Stephen Cornell also explains per caps before this were just extremely unusual, so they never thought it would be something that had become relatively common. So are per caps helpful? There is empirical evidence on the eastern band of Cherokee. So the Great Smoky Mountain Studies covers a representative sample of children from 11 counties, ages 9 and 11. And they were interviewed annually until they were 16. Their parents were also interviewed, and they oversampled Eastern Band Cherokee children. And 5 years into the study, Eastern Band Cherokee opened a casino, and these dividends came in. So they kind of, they got lucky a little bit that something like this happened where they were able to measure before and after and also have impoverished households to compare to. And what they found was a reduction in criminality. They found a reduction in alcoholism. There's a lot, and I won't mention everything so I get stuck here, but it was a study of mental health and youth, so there's a great deal of data in regards to that and how the payments affected that particular subject. So I think people last year when I mentioned like Native people weren't sold on this were like surprised, and they were like, why? Once we give money to people, aren't they just 100% happy? And I didn't know how to answer it, but it's a lot more complicated than I think I was able to discuss last time. So per capita distribution, this next arguments are from a paper written by Stephen Cornell from the American Indian Economic Development Institute, where he interviewed tribal members, and these are the common arguments for and against per cap. So why for per cap? So per capita payments help citizens meet their most urgent needs on reservations where they may not have other jobs or resources, so there just may not be other options as far as what to do with the revenue. Citizens get to decide what to do with their money instead of tribal government. So it's a lot of Native people are so suspicious of governments in general, they would actually are suspicious of their own governments. They don't want any concentrated control, concentrated money, like truly spread out. And many tribal governments can end up running poorly, and there's historical reasons for that, such as the constitutions that tribes were forced to adapt during the Indian Reorganization Act. And so when they reinvest these revenues maybe into businesses or other things, sometimes those go poorly and then no one benefits. And the events of factionalism or nepotism, which sometimes can occur, this ensures everyone benefits instead of a few families. And also some say putting all revenue into tribal governments' hands is a form of dependence on themselves. Now we're dependent on our tribal governments to decide what to do with our money in a way that we can only hopefully hope is helpful to us. It also reduces the bureaucratization of ceremony and other time-honored community-run functions. We don't have to, some of our ceremonies need a lot of materials we no longer have access to that we need to get through money. And so not having to do that through a tribal government is beneficial to some. And this positive struck me as concerning. I don't know who said it, I would love to find out. But it can be used strategically, which means it can be used coercively. So, are you not paying your child support? We're going to take a chunk out. Do you owe court fines to tribal courts? We're going to take it out. There's even proposals for a 3 strikes law. So you get 3 felonies, then you no longer get per cap anymore. Okay. And other things like that. So that reaffirms the idea of conditionality being important, because once this money's out there, it can actually be used, if penalized, to get people to do what you want to a large degree, or it can really be used to, especially in the U.S. context, I think it might make sense in some tribal governments. In the U.S. context, that kind of deal can really pick on the people who are most vulnerable. So why are people against per cap? Well, there's some anti-social welfare sentiment in Native communities, and let me explain that as quickly as I can. So imagine someone comes in, kills your family, takes your house and your Xbox away. They give you like a little closet, and you no longer have the means to sustain yourself. And then they come in and they give you canned pork and canned meat, and then they give that to you and they tell you, you're social welfare dependent, like you're dependent on the government, you get free stuff, all this thing. So you take away our methods of sustaining ourselves, and then you get these things just so they don't die in reverse. So a lot of communities really want to get to a point of becoming self-reliant again in the ways they were, and don't always view this as being able to do that. For some of the reasons, like they say, people will be less interested in employment, education, might decrease work ethic. I think we all agree that's not necessarily the case. And I also would say that's a minority view. Another negative. Tribal governments are not rich capitalist economies like the United States. There's some serious decisions that have to be made with tribal revenue. So it might be the difference between building a new healthcare facility for elders or giving everyone $200 every 6 months. So those decisions vary, there's all kinds of them, but there's not unlimited money in almost any situation, so we have to be strategic with what we do with it. All right. Casinos go out of business, per capita go in any second. Investing revenue is tax-free, feds tax per caps, and then the disenrollment epidemic. So one of the most prominent political reasons people oppose them is because of what Gabriel Glanda, a Native lawyer, calls the disenrollment epidemic. So since the passing of IGRA, there's been a drop in membership rates, and a lot of people think that this is due to per cap, especially the smaller tribes. There's incentive to make them smaller through different means, and then the per caps go higher. And then there's also the opposite. All of a sudden, tribes with maybe less strict enrollment have experienced frauds, the ballooning of enrollment. So it's either shrunk or gone down, which is obviously concerning. In the very first instance of per cap ever, there was disenrollment. So the first time the Northern Youth, they asked that they did not get per caps. They did not want these individual cash payments. And yet that was the only way they get the money, and it destroyed their tribe. And I can get into this more, I guess, if anyone wants to talk to me after. I'm trying to get through. But it created factions, and they're still dealing with membership issues to this day. 2 minutes. All right. Pokagamins, Potawatomi Indians, that's where I come from. I did a quick 8 in-depth interview study with them. Ours is very modest. I'm not going to say the amounts that we distribute. I don't think any tribe should reveal the amounts they do at this point after doing the work I have. And I think the main reason for that is 1, financial predators, and 2, the ways in which academics can use research in negative ways. Tribes have been treated horribly by academics in our history, and I think we have relative reason to be suspicious. Going forward, and I'm kind of skipping around, but going forward, in studying per caps and what it can tell us about basic income, we're going to have to figure out ways around knowing that number, perhaps. And maybe then it no longer makes sense, and maybe that has to be okay. Where I'm at now is figuring out ways for tribes to be able to evaluate their own per capita programs to see how they're working, and they can choose, once those evaluations are done, whether they want those public. But as sovereign nations, they certainly shouldn't feel obligated to. In my research, which was qualitative interviews, people reported being able to fix their cars, small things like that, with fairly modest income, going from 1 to 2 bedroom apartments. Maybe if there's 2 people in the house, they could move to a duplex with a yard. So very intense, pretty good quality of life increases. And so I kind of said the end before already, so I guess that's all I got.
Good morning. Let me give you a flavor for where my current research has its origin. I've been interested in basic income for quite a few years, but only a few years ago I became interested in addition to income mobility, especially upward income mobility, what's referred to as absolute income mobility. Partly because I think most of us, or at least certainly it's true for me, would be even more interested in equality of opportunity than equality of income. I also think that from a political perspective, that sells more easily to a pretty heterogeneous population as we have in the US and in most countries. If a person has ample opportunity and elects not to make as much income, I think that's a perfectly fine thing. I'm less concerned about a person like that having less income than a person simply having less income because she or he is unable to find the means or develop the skills or education to get that. So I scratched my head one day as I was just reading through some mobility literature about the question, could a basic income really change mobility? Because most of my thinking, and the thinking of a lot of other people, has been, I think, that Basic income, we talk about very, very frequently as a remedy for current inequality right now, the here and now, where we find the distribution unacceptable and getting worse. But if in fact we found an association with upward mobility, that would give it stronger effects. Now, I don't want to paint the basic income discussion over the last couple of decades as only concerned with the here and now, because there's obviously been reference to improvement in educational opportunities, improvement in healthcare and things like that, the effects, beneficial effects on our children. But usually kind of as footnotes rather than a central concern. The absolute income mobility in the US since 1940, and this comes from work by an increasingly well-known economist currently at Stanford, formerly at Harvard, Raj Chetty, from a paper he wrote called The Fading of the American Dream 2 or 3 years ago. Absolute income mobility defined very simply as the percent of children who earn more than their parents at similar ages, okay? Children born in 1940, 90% would grow up to have higher incomes than their parents. Children born in the 80s, 50%. Now there are many reasons for that we're not getting into with this research, but so not only have middle class wages sort of stagnated, the rate at which the poor are able to reach the middle class has slowed substantially. The tradition within economics, which is where I come from, has been to see equality and what's termed economic efficiency as in contention with each other, okay? This is the cover of a book published first in 1975 by Arthur Okun, then well-known economist, called Equality and Efficiency, the Big Trade-Off, right? And it, you know, along with other works, spawned a vast literature trying to show the sources of the trade-off. Usually they were labor supply issues. For recipients of a redistribution, there were often very large, what some would call benefit reduction rates. Economists sometimes term them effective marginal tax rates that would greatly deter work, okay? Some of the benefit reduction rates were 90% or so for a single program, and sometimes over 100% for multiple recipients of multiple programs in combination, okay? So that if I'm in this category and I go out and work and I make an extra dollar and I have to give 90 cents back in benefits, that's a pretty severe work disincentive, all right? Likewise, but less significant for the net contributors or funders of the distribution who have to pay higher tax rates, there's some estimated work disincentive effect. So the story as it went within economics literatures for far too long was that greater equality, which is a certainly important value, always comes at the cost of efficiency, meaning less well-functioning economy, less productive economy, and so forth. Now, an economist named Alan Kruger, recently deceased, just a very few years ago popularized something that came to be known as the Gatsby curve, which seems to go in another direction. And this past spring at my college, we had a pretty well-known economist from Harvard, Mankiw, And I posed the question because he talked about the open work and the trade-off and all that. And he actually likes the basic income and gave a plug for Andrew Yang. But despite that, he thinks that basic income necessarily is going to cost the economy with respect to efficiency. Some of the modeling in the very first session this morning, at least with Kent Smetter's work, suggests that to some extent. So I posed this thing, and I'll show you the graphic for the Gadsby curve in a second, but essentially it's saying that greater equality, or excuse me, greater inequality leads to less mobility, okay? And it looks like this. Now, it's a little hard to wrap your head around quickly, but on the horizontal axis, we have, as you go left to right, income inequality getting larger and larger, okay? And on the vertical axis, somewhat counterintuitively, we have a measure of mobility that is going in reverse. The higher you go on the axis, the less mobility. And what we see here is some of these folks, the US, for example, the UK, and Italy notably, these are OECD countries, very high degrees of income inequality and low degrees relative to the others of mobility. Now, and there's this nicely fitted line there that suggests that these two are in opposition. I got this graph just by Googling, if you wanted to. But it's been around for at least 5-6 years, I think. Mankiw's response when I raised this in his presentation was, oh, you know, so you got a correlation, but that says nothing about causation, okay? Kind of a standard answer. So my question was, well, okay, it's possible, but if in fact we could distribute income somewhat more equally, and it also improved, you know, via basic income or some similar redistributive program, and it improved mobility, that would give the basic income folks another strong argument in its favor. Okay. So, I began this with pessimism though, because to me, if I'm a recipient of a net recipient of basic income, maybe I would get a little more schooling, but if I'm a kid, it's not going to necessarily go out and change my school system. Okay. It doesn't change in the US what is often being referred to these days as unequal geography of opportunity. It doesn't necessarily change the long-standing effects of racism that limit opportunities or ameliorate some of the other poverty traps. So, what I have set out to do, and I'm far from over, is examining the extent to which past and existing programs that are simply intended as redistributive, like earned income tax credit, like the food stamp program, and so forth, and another program I'll mention in a minute, did they change mobility? Now this is tough to gather data on, right? Because you need longitudinal data. The question is, would a poor family today in receipt of a transfer spend it in a way on their children that enhances the children's income and other well-being, you know, when they become adults decades later? Okay, so you have to have pretty large longitudinal data set. Some of those exist, but not as many as we'd like. So, because I'm running low on time, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which has been mentioned a couple of times in this conference, Chetty, in a 2013 paper, shows significant impact on mobility controlling for income segregation by geography. Now, one of the things he's done, and he's done prolific work, he and a number of colleagues of his, they've taken just US data. The graph I showed you a minute ago compared aggregate data for different countries on mobility, all right? But what he's shown is mobility varies tremendously across the US. Okay, so we can talk about an aggregate, an average, but in fact, some areas have much greater mobility than others, and we can see how EITC has varied from one area to another because the state programs for EITC vary in size. Some states don't have any at all. Other states that have them have different amounts. So you can have enough variability in your data to draw inferences. He's shown not huge amounts of mobility that result, but some. Bastian, 2018 paper, shows it, but mainly for children in the households ranges 13 to 18. Bowman, 2009, shows there's little evidence that EITC affects fertility rates, which would be a criticism of having a benefit that significantly changes with the number of children in the household and that kind of thing. Food stamps, you might say that's not a cash transfer program. Well, no, it's not. But effectively, it operates very much as if it is. The participation studied by Hoynes and colleagues increased future earnings of children, increased education of children, reduced incidence of metabolic syndrome for children. The younger the initial age of exposure, the larger the cumulative effect. Now, there's a final program I'll finish up. Something called, and I was unfamiliar with this, but there was an article published about 3 years ago by Azer in the American Economic Review on something called the Mother's Pension Program, which existed from 1911 to 1935. You might say, that's not real current. Why are you going there? Well, the answer is there weren't lots of other programs going on at the same time, so it was easier to isolate effects. And with these programs, you know, you might think they wouldn't work too well because parents might not spend the money on their children. Transfers might be too small to do much good. Parents might not be well informed about the efficacy of different spending options. But in fact, even though people in the program were only there on median duration 3 years, increased their household income 12 to 15%, and it was focused on single mother-headed households, it increased income in early adulthood for the children who had been in these families by 14%, increased educational attainment by a third of a year, reduced probability of being underweight by 50%, and increased life expectancy by a year and a year and a half for the poorest. So a program where households only participated about 3 years had some significant effects. What if the money had been of the size we talked about with basic income? What if the duration were many, many, many years, not 3 years? Okay, I'll cut it there since I'm out of time. Steal my water back. Thank you.
Where is the presentation material? Here. Okay. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending to this session. My name is Leandro, I'm from Brazil. Actually have just formalized our Brazilian Basic Income Network in an association, in a formal association. Before that, we were more like a movement. Now we hope we can conduct more research and start more campaigns about basic income. And I'm engaged into it, especially from 2 months to here. And what I want to talk about is part of my research in my master program that I have accomplished in February. You will see that I'm focusing especially on how cash transfers in Brazil can turn into a basic income, a universal and unconditioned basic income. I'll try a public policy approach that tries to import the concept of path dependence from the economics to politics. So, but first, we have to start with most of the public policy theories call as a subsystem. What is a subsystem? It's an intermediate level where policy takes place. Decision-making, implementation, evaluation, and the participants of a subsystem are not only the major politics we see in the news, but not also the technicians responsible for specific activities in implementation in the implementation of a public policy. It's more like an intermediate level where these people interact. It's politics and technicians and public opinion and everyone else as part of a subsystem. This is used with different concepts and different theories in public policy, like multiple streams from John Kingdon. It's a very famous one. But also the punctuated equilibrium from Johnson Baumgartner, and especially advocacy coalition framework from Jakin Smith and Paul Sabatier. But in my research, what I try to do is to put in the paper what all of these theories point out as part of a subsystem. So the things I have identified are these 7 important points. First, it's a substantial issue. It means that something to create, to be reason for the existence of a subsystem, it has to be something meaningful, it has to be something substantial. There's also a second point about territorial boundaries. So a policy takes place in a certain territorial boundary, and this is part of the formation of the subsystem. Also because, as it leads to our third point, it defines who can participate or not. Because perhaps if it's a nationwide policy, it's a nationwide boundary, so everybody in the country participates. But if it's a municipal level, a state level, that's different. And there are also rules of participation that are not attached to the boundaries, but for example, the conditions for someone to participate that might be very specific. For example, for technicians to be certified by government levels to implement or to evaluate a policy, or for example, if you need to be elected to be decision making around that policy. So there are participation rules defined for every subsystem. This subsystem is also supported by legal norms and parameters defined by legislation especially, but also not only bills and laws, but especially norms in an infra-legal level that you can only access depending on your specific engagement in the subsystem. There are also instruments. Policies need instruments to take place. Policy depends on how the state or someone in name of the state create the means of action around that public policy. And least, there's also the public policy impact, because the subsystem is also conformed depending on the public policy impact or the expected impact, because people hope to change something, or people hope to participate in the results or the political results of that change. So the public policy impact is also important for the subsystem conformation. And which subsystem is basic income? Well, that may change from country to country, and I put something here in the paper that is not actually valid for every country. Because, for example, we just had Social Security and EITC approach. That's really important, but I see basic income being discussed out of these terms in the US a lot of times. So the Silicon Valley perspective, they are really far from the Social Security perspective. But we don't have a Silicon Valley in Brazil, so I'm staying around what I call a non-contributive income guarantee subsystem. That means the non-contributive part here is a very specific point, because it means that you are eligible regardless of your previous contribution. That's what non-contributive means for this research. And we have multiple policies that have the objective of guaranteeing an income for people in Brazil depending on their conditions. For example, we have strong support for elderly in social assistance fields. But we also have the cash transfers for people that are poor, and the major program here is Bolsa Família, which many of you have heard about. And here I try to, based on Paul Pearson, try to identify which are the processes that generate path dependence. And I'll try to get it really fast, because it's not easy to explain that. But there are 4 different processes identified by Paul Pearson. The first one is an increased return process, which means that everyone that makes a choice makes the whole process more profitable for those who have made that same choice. So as more people are added to a specific mechanism, to a specific instrument, or to a specific policy, it turns that policy more profitable for society. So it turns that something better for those who have made that decision before. There's a self-reinforcement process, that is how actors, how stakeholders in a subsystem try to maintain or make their position better. That's true, for example, for our many actions around, for example, holding coalitions for a basic income. We are always trying to reinforce our position or to make it better. There's a positive negative feedback process that is also important, because especially because of the negative feedbacks, because as much as a policy grows, it turns out that the different alternatives are less attractive, because they cost more. To go back to that policy costs more than staying in that same process that other people have chosen to be. And there's also a lock-in effect. The lock-in effect is a point in which, after so many people have chosen the same thing, right, so many choices have been made, or so many uses of instruments have been made around the same decision or process that it's impossible to turn back to the other alternative. That's really famous for the QWERTY keyboard for computers. There were a lot of options of keyboards. I don't know, maybe there were like 3 or 4 factories only in Manhattan with different keyboards. And now you can try this in your smartphone, because you can still go back to the 9020s keyboards or 9030s keyboard, and we don't know how to use it for a cognitive limitation. So there's a cognitive limitation, there's an economic limitation, there's a political limitation to things that were left behind by the political process. And the politics has also its own characteristics that attached to those things are really important. For example, the collective action nature of politics, the density of institutions, the political authority that enhance the power symmetries. That's really important, because sometimes we discuss the basic income as an alternative in the political process. No, there's a political authority that makes it out of the table, that puts it out of the table. We don't even get to the discussion, because people who really decide about that don't consider that is an option. So that's how these power asymmetries affects everything. And of course, there's a complexity and opacity of everything in politics, not for a bad reason, but people engaged in a subsystem, you don't know everyone, you don't know which goals each person pursues, you don't agree with everyone's belief, but you necessarily, for the collective action nature politics, have to act along with all those people engaged in the same subsystem that you are. So how path dependence affects cash transfers? Strong legal norms, having instruments, strong legal norms are difficult to change, and they might have a locking effect. For example, I'm running because of time. Heavy instruments, like for example, to reach people with Bolsa Família in Brazil, we use a huge database that is the same for housing and for pensions and for everything else. So this is a heavy instrument that we have to deal with, and we cannot say that a basic income, for example, will turn things less bureaucratic, because we can get rid of this instrument. This is a heavy instrument. There's a policy impact, and that's the point that's really important for me now, especially because of the Brazilian situation that most of you know about, or some of you have asked me about. But for example, is it difficult to change policy towards a basic income because of path dependence? It is. But it is also difficult to go back to a scenario that is even worse. And that's how I want to show you this. That's why I want to show you this. This is the Bolsa Família program data I just extracted this morning. And we are around 14.3 million families inside the program. And here, you can see that many people in Brazil use it to say, oh, this is a Workers' Party program that will end whenever the Workers' Party leave. And in fact, the Workers' Party left around here. That's the number of beneficiaries, and that's the whole amount of money paid to those beneficiaries. The Workers' Party government ended here in a very complicated situation. And the program, in fact, lost 1 million families in its numbers. But after that, all those things, all those norms, those instruments were able to recover more than we had before. So Right now, we are in a record number for people receiving Bolsa Familia. It's a quarter of the population. Even though we have a government that's truly and openly against this. They are, of course, trying to change it. But the money still goes up, and because of the results of the policy impacts, they will have a tough time trying to change this, and we can talk more about because my time is over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for 4 very interesting presentations on 4 very important topics. So, unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes left, so I'll ask for up to 3 very short, focused questions that we'll turn over to the panel and get through at least 1 round and maybe 2 if we're lucky. So, Victoria.
Yes, thank you. This is for Andrew, and I come from Canada, which is from the Treaty 1 area, the traditional lands of the Ojibwe and Cree people. So we bring you greetings from there. My concern and my anxiety raised when you were describing, it seemed like a reapportionment of the monies that were already being given to the tribes, because obviously those have always been inadequate. They come from a very toxic place. My understanding is that if there was a income guarantee, that this would be fresh money coming in per person, be that as it may be, the enlarging or the shrinking, you know, what you were describing before, but that this would be fresh money. And I would supplement that by saying that as a lawyer who provided services to many First Nations people, particularly abused, who were basically kicked out of or having difficulty within a particular tribe because, of course, it tends to be can be nepotistic because of the patriarchal structure that replaced the traditional governance of First Nations people, that this may have, that very often people are caught within situations, as they would be in the general population, because they didn't have money of their own that they could use. So
okay.
my question is, you seem to speak of the reapportionment of monies already there, whether from gaming or whatever, but my understanding is that income guarantee would be fresh money from outside per person. Could you speak about that, please?
Okay, go ahead, Thomas, maybe respond to that specifically if you can.
Sorry, Thomas, I said Andrew, I apologize. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. Yes, I guess that would be a difference. What difference that would make, I'm not totally sure. I just can't know. I'm sure it wouldn't have the effect on enrollment that maybe revenues within have had in some communities. And yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said generally. I just didn't have time to say everything.
Yeah. But you seem to be talking about a portion of money that was already given by the federal government or whatever, but this is money that would be coming from outside, would it not?
Basic
income?
Yeah, basic income would.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, the person at the back, and then Michael, and then this person.
Hi, good morning. My name is Joseph. I am the executive director of a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. I'm looking at cash transfers and minimizing the racial wealth gap. Thomas, thank you for your presentation. Quick question. Anything we can be extrapolating from research you've done on the qualitative side towards reparations-related cash transfers?
So, they're very different. So possibly. One thing that did come up a lot in the interviews that I didn't mention, and there's actually been other qualitative research, really large ones, is that when casinos open and when payments, if they are distributed, usually there's a lot of friction between the white and native communities, because most of these communities those are the two races in these rural areas. And people reported in large percentages hearing comments regularly. And it also changes the dynamic sometimes of these areas where all of a sudden the largest employer, Native people maybe even have some of the better material conditions suddenly, and that suddenly has stoked resentment and all kinds of things. So I don't know if that, I'm not going to speak on reparations any more, like I'm not an expert in that area, so maybe there is something to extrapolate from that, possibly. Yeah.
Okay, Michael.
This is also for Thomas. Knowing what you know about the way these disbursements work on reserves, do you think there are any lessons for the rest of us to think about a basic income for the whole country? Are there lessons for us to learn based on what you've seen there? I mean, are there things we should watch out for, think about, not do? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I should have included that whole thing at the end. I think the main things is any condition can become problematic, even ones that seem reasonable. So like ones like high school diploma requirements are one that pretty much any tribe that has per capita is starting to use. I think penalizing them through like courts. Also, one like big legal question right now is what happens to them during bankruptcy. I would be curious what happens to basic income during bankruptcy, things like that. And then two, the biggest concern I have out of all of this is what will immigration rhetoric, will it change once there's a full basic income? And there's a history of anti-immigration rhetoric that's far stronger than what we have. What could that do to the country? Does that, we might, conversations of who is and isn't an American citizen might become different. So I'd say that's like the word of warning is that like when these come, people all of a sudden become very protective of it. And if it comes from revenue, if there's any incentive to make the citizenship base smaller so the payments go up, it's going to be a nightmare. But I don't know that many proposals are based on a revenue in that way. And there's certainly other extrapolations, I would think, especially in like how often you do it. I think the tribes that have had a lot of success do it every 2 weeks, like a work check. And I think that has a lot of benefits to it.
Okay, we're just about at the end of our time. I'm wondering, since we haven't, these have been very good questions directed to Thomas. Around that question of lessons for rollout, I wonder if we might call on the other three panelists. I know Leandro he's talking about a program that exists in Bolsa Familia. Jim and Steve have talked about kind of proposals or possible programs of the future, but maybe we could hear a few remarks from each of the other three, and then we'll have to wind it up, and maybe you can pigeonhole folks in the hall and ask them for pose any further questions. So, Leandro?
So thank you. Actually, I had the opportunity to talk to so many people from yesterday and this morning, and just like to say thank you. Everyone has been aware of the Brazilian situation, and we've been in a struggle for basic income for long years now. And although the political moment might be not as good as it once was, for example, we had a Bien Congressons there in Brazil. We are actually really excited about the possibility of turning things around, especially with the basic income, because now it's a big issue. Like Carl Waldeck uses to say, there's the buzz, and the buzz is certainly helping us to make more effective everything that we're doing there. So thank you.
Thanks, Leandro. Jim, any last thoughts?
A couple quickly. I've been studying non-basic income programs for implications they might have for basic income and mobility, so rollout maybe hasn't come to mind as much, but two things, and this is old, not new. I do believe that because the buzz, as Leandro mentioned, around basic income is growing exponentially, a very good thing. We need to emphasize some of the virtues of this kind of program relative to the highly targeted, means-tested kinds of programs that are more traditional. We haven't been talking about those as much here because we've done it so many times before. But the general population is not as aware. Second thing is, within the US, over the last 40 years, 1979 till now, one slide I didn't get to for lack of time was the distribution of children over income. How children are distributed over the income range has changed quite a bit. Not eye-poppingly, but enough to take note. In the lowest quintile, we've gone from about 24% of our children in the lowest quintile of household income to about 28%. The lowest two quintiles have about, so 40% of the households have just over 50% of the children. And in a couple of the higher quintiles, proportion of children necessarily is arithmetically lower. That means that I favor an emphasis on children via a basic income because I guess I have a strong interest in this mobility question. A basic income which is per person equally or thereabouts would by its structure necessarily have greater effects on household income in the low levels. And I think that's a notable and not very much discussed fact.
Okay, and some final remarks from Steve and we'll wind up.
So my scheme is designed to win over the middle class because politically it's a non-starter otherwise. But, and the charts that I showed indicated that. But the changes at the lower level are huge and we don't know exactly what's going to happen. So I think it's been discussed in other sessions, the risk that changes will be made at the state and local level to withdraw programs that people have come. So there's risks there, and we're just hoping that the cash, that it won't be complete and that the cash will help them. That's already been raised. But I did pick up a lesson from Thomas's presentation, something that had occurred to me, which is the predatory aspect. When everyone knows that everyone out there has, $1,000 a month coming in, especially where they're coming from, there's some things that might happen with that aren't very pleasant. And the other thing that he brought up that I think is really important is to make sure that the guarantee is locked in, that it can't be used against these people and being taken away. It really needs to be just unconditional. So that's all I have to add.
Okay, so we'll wind up here. We reconvene at 2 o'clock in this room and also in a parallel session in 1:15. But please join me in thanking